A few months ago, I made a video on this channel about Sabu being fired from ECW and his entire run in WCW that followed in 1995. What I didn't know at the time is that there was nearly a return on the cards years later. While reading an old Wrestling Observer for another video, I fell down yet another wrestling rabbit hole, and I learned a lot about how one of ECW's most memorable legends ended up leaving the company in 2000, a full year before the company shut down. I thought I'd make a sequel, and so this video is about what happened. The story starts at ECW Guilty as Charged on January 9th, 2000, where in one of the key matches of the night, Sabu would lose to Rob Van Dam near the end of his epic television title reign. Earlier in the broadcast, Sabu's manager Bill Alfonso claimed on behalf of the famously mute Sabu, "I guarantee if Sabu doesn't beat Rob Van Dam, he'll grab his bags and walk out tonight." As Sabu lost, many thought we'd seen the last of him, but as Joel Gertner and Joey Styles explained on the following week's TNN episode, it was never specified that he would leave the company, only that he would walk out. But walk out on who? Rob Van Dam certainly didn't think this, telling us in a promo on the same episode that Sabu shouldn't have gambled his career against RVD, muddying the waters even more. A week later on TNN, the lights would go out in the arena, and when they came back on, Sabu would appear in the ring. He was seemingly there to side with RVD against the world champion Mike Awesome. This wouldn't be the case though, as he would throw a chair in Van Dam's face, turning on him, and even putting their shared manager Bill Alfonso through a table, walking out on their long and very complicated friendship. I mean, sort of friendship. We would later find out in the January 24th Wrestling Observer that the talk of Sabu walking out was a Paul Heyman suggestion, who didn't intend for this to imply that Sabu was retiring or even leaving ECW. This part smells of bullshit, as Paul was clearly being intentionally vague with the phrase walk out, trying to make the fans think that Sabu might be leaving. Unbeknownst to even Heyman at this point, Sabu soon would be leaving. In the same issue, Dave Meltzer claims that Sabu hadn't been happy in his role in ECW for quite some time. Sabu, who is 36, is unhappy because it's clear he can no longer be the star of the company, and his role on pay-per-views is largely to put people over. Interestingly, a few weeks before Dave wrote this, Wade Keller in the Pro Wrestling Torch noted that at age 36, Sabu was the oldest wrestler in ECW. Awesome is near the top of the list at 34. His record on pay-per-view wasn't too bad though, despite Sabu recently losing to RVD, as well as Just Incredible and Taz in '99. He also beat Chris Candido, and was undefeated on pay-per-view in '98, apart from a draw with Van Dam. That's 3 losses and a draw in his last 8 pay-per-views over the previous 2 years. But he still wasn't the main event attraction that he used to be. A few days later, ECW would suffer some bad news, as 2 of its top babyfaces would go down with injuries. Jerry Lynn had hurt his ankle, and the TV champion Rob Van Dam broke his fibula, leading both to be away for roughly 8 weeks. Surely not a great time to lose another top star, but Paul Heyman was about to. His original main event for the upcoming Living Dangerously pay-per-view was reported to be Sabu and Mike Awesome against Van Dam and Masato Tanaka. Not that Paul knew it at the time, but he was soon to lose Awesome to WCW as well. Incidentally, just mentioning it, but I have a video about that on this channel as well. Sabu's last matches on ECW television would be on the January 28th TNN episode, and the day after on Hardcore TV. On TNN, he would attack RVD from behind, building to the Living Dangerously match that Paul was aiming towards, but would never happen. And the night after, he would defeat C.W. Anderson in the main event of the show. During the match, he attacks Anderson's manager Louis Dangerously, whose gimmick was that he impersonated Paul Heyman, and tried to put him through a table, but CW moved him out of the way. I wonder what that could have meant. The last sight of Sabu on ECW television is him pinning Anderson after a ropey-looking triple jump moonsault, which is to say, he appeared to low blow himself on CW's knee, and instead of celebrating, sold the low blow. The week after these matches were taped, Sabu would wrestle Spike Dudley on a house show in St. Petersburg, Florida. By this point, Sabu may have had enough, or may have seen an opportunity to improve his position in ECW. In a 2022 interview with James Romero, Sabu claims that around this time he was approached by Kevin Sullivan and JJ Dillon from WCW. He calls this a secret meeting and says about it, "My thinking was I was going to go to WCW, make a buttload of money, then go back to ECW and pick up where I left off. But when I went there, somebody saw me and called Paul." I'm sure this isn't what he means, but the idea of Sabu sneaking in a WCW run with Paul somehow not noticing was just really funny to me. He later explains that he was meeting with WCW underhandedly, but says, "My intention was to come back stronger than I was. I could come back a bigger name, and I could carry the company better." This isn't much of a spoiler, but Paul Heyman didn't see it the same way. The following week's Observer had a lot more to say about Sabu potentially leaving ECW. A full story details how he had agreed to a deal on February 2nd with WCW, after talks between the two sides had been going on for at least several days, prompting threats of a lawsuit by Paul Heyman and ECW. Paul was claiming that he had Sabu signed to a contract that lasted until January 2003, which may have been true, but as the Torch explains, Sabu told WCW officials that ECW had breached his contract on several occasions. Therefore, he considered himself a free agent. Wade goes on to explain the possible issue with Sabu's belief of this, saying that if Sabu believed his contract had been breached, he was required to provide this in writing and allow ECW 90 days to rectify the dispute. If more of Paul's top talent had a similar rule in their contracts, this might explain, in part at least, why so many wrestlers stayed with ECW while being owed growing amounts of money. That 90-day part feels like a way for Paul to buy himself some time in financial disputes. And to be clear, that's just me speculating, and not anything I've read anywhere. It doesn't sound from any source I've read like Sabu put his grievance in writing first, and so Paul had him there. In the same story, Keller notes that WCW wants Sabu to start on the February 14th Nitro, because they believe they can showcase him on a show that will be unopposed by Raw. This edition of Raw would have been preempted by the Westminster Dog Show, and so in theory, Nitro would have had more eyes on it. Dave Meltzer goes on to note that they even had Sabu penciled in for a match at that week's Super Brawl pay-per-view against the Kiss Demon. But Paul Heyman began legal talks on the 7th that halted this. If you're wondering, the Demon would have to settle for a match against the Wall Brother. Heyman on February 7th said that he was willing to sell his rights to Sabu's contract to WCW, since there really is no upside to his returning to the company at this point. But he said he simply wouldn't let him go without something in return, and if no settlement was made, threatened a temporary restraining order against both Brunk and WCW to keep him from appearing on the show, as well as threatened a lawsuit and a complaint to the Justice Department over a contract tampering charge. On top of all of this, both newsletters note a part of Sabu's personal life that may also have prevented him from debuting on Nitro when WCW wanted him to. Sabu's mother, with whom he is especially close, suffered 2 heart attacks last week. Sabu spent nearly every minute of his time by her side ever since, and may not be mentally ready to wrestle. The Torch would report a few weeks later that Sabu's mother would leave the hospital feeling better, but still with some health issues. On February 11th, 2000, Rob Van Dam, who might have been feuding with Sabu on TV, but was still close with him in real life, would, on a call with Slam Wrestling, make some interesting comments about what Sabu's priorities might have actually been. I've talked to Sabu and honestly, he's going through some personal stuff at home right now, with his mother being sick. And when I talk to Sabu, it's not really even about business. Later on, when discussing the idea that Sabu leaving will hurt ECW, RVD says, "It's not gonna do us in or anything like that. Right now, I don't even think it's the most important thing on his mind." With these comments, Van Dam is implying that Sabu's mother might well be his incentive to make that buttload of money I mentioned earlier. Though in nothing I've read is this ever explicitly said. A week later, It seems that Paul Heyman got his way, and Sabu would not be going to WCW after all. At this point, it appears he won't even be coming in, and his future in the US is temporarily in question. WCW was forced to drop all plans with him due to his contract with ECW. WCW in a letter to Heyman said they had no interest in buying out his contract. The interesting part there is Dave claiming that Sabu's future in the US was in doubt. This is because, as he later notes, the whole situation seems to have soured Paul on Sabu, who he had fired once before in '95. Heyman had indicated to many that he wasn't interested in using Brunk any longer, but with his own promotion devastated by injuries, that could change. Before I leave the subject of WCW, this whole story got me wondering what a Sabu return in 2000 might have looked like. It's worth noting that the World Championship Wrestling that Sabu was briefly a part of in '95 was a very different place to the way the company was in 2000. The NWO wasn't even a thing yet, and now it was on its 40th iteration. Vince Russo was in creative now, and as far as I can tell, Russo may have worked with Sabu in the TNA Asylum years, but never for a prolonged period. Perhaps more importantly, by this time, WCW had a hardcore championship, which I'm willing to bet is where Sabu would have ended up on the card. He would likely have been having classic matches with the likes of Screaming Norman Smiley and Brian Knobbs, or maybe, if we're lucky, the entirety of 3 Count, who at one point were hardcore champions together. Sabu was part of some of the early episodes of Nitro, and if things had played out differently, he could well have been on the last ones as well. On February 25th and 26th, 2000, Sabu would wrestle what would become his final weekend of matches for the company, on a house show tour of Ohio. First on the Friday, he would defeat Mikey Whipwreck in Toledo, and on the night after in Cincinnati, he would win against Scott D'Amore, who was still an active wrestler at this point. Both were described in The Observer as bad matches, perhaps an indicator of where Sabu's head was at. As a side note, this would be one of the 2 matches that Scott D'Amore would have for ECW, as on the night before in Toledo, he would lose to Chilly Willy. Aye, I'd forgotten about him too. The Torch claimed after Sabu's first weekend back that everything was not fully resolved though. Locker room speculation is that Paul Heyman is waiting for Sabu to breach his contract by either no-showing an event or refusing a match finish. Those who know confirm that this is the case, and say that if either event occurs, Heyman will immediately file a legal complaint. Sabu would work the weekend with no issues, made easier by Paul Heyman not being at the Toledo event, and he was next advertised for a show at the ECW Arena on March 4th. The Torch also notes that the creative plans for a team with Mike Awesome have been dropped, and we would later find out that Sabu's next feud was set to be against a man who the Observer claimed was being set up to replace Sabu, Super Crazy. This was claimed because in Sabu's absence, Super Crazy started going through more tables and was being elevated towards the television championship that he would win at Living Dangerously. On March 11th, the Torch would report that Sabu was finally done in ECW. Wade Keller explains that Sabu had been allowed to miss the March 3rd show, a TV taping in Asbury Park, New Jersey, to look after his mother, but later found out that he had taken an indie booking in Calgary and was claiming that he couldn't get back to Philadelphia for the next show on time. After arguing the issue with Paul Heyman, Sabu told Heyman that he would only come to the show if ECW were to pay to have former ECW referee Pee Wee Moore, real name John Marks, flown in to act as Sabu's witness. The company would refuse to do this, so Sabu would bring Pee Wee there himself. Later in the night, a conversation is said to have taken place where Sabu disagreed with his creative. Heyman handed Sabu a script for his match, which was signed and dated, and went over the plans with him. The script called for Sabu to interfere in the Super Crazy vs C.W. Anderson match, and for the match to become a 3-way involving Sabu. Sabu was supposed to pin Anderson, but lose to Crazy after missing a table spot. Sabu shook Heyman's hand, thanked him, and quietly grabbed his gear and left the building. At this point, Paul Heyman washed his hands of Sabu, claiming he would never work in ECW again. He had said this about many other talents, but people were convinced that he meant it this time. Heyman feels he made a good faith effort to work things out with Sabu, even after Sabu signed a deal with WCW while under an ECW contract. Heyman wants to set a precedent with Sabu, letting other wrestlers know that they will not be able to walk out on their contracts. Sabu would like to sign a deal with WCW, but Heyman is telling people that he will not allow that to happen. As best I can tell, Sabu remained under ECW contract, leaving his status to work elsewhere in the US in question. For what it's worth, Dave Meltzer published a more cynical take on what happened, noting that nobody else in ECW was ever presented a script like Sabu was on March 4th, and this was likely done should more legal back and forth take place. He also implies that Heyman expected to get the reaction that he did out of Sabu. It's pretty clear that Heyman knew ahead of time that Sabu would never put over Crazy, because Sabu is stuck in that Ed Farhat mentality about doing jobs and feels he's done enough of them. One thing that's unclear in The Observer, much like in The Torch, was Sabu's current contractual status, whether Sabu had been fired or if Heyman kept him under his deal. One thing is for sure though, Heyman wasn't going to let him out of his deal to go to World Championship Wrestling. So if Sabu didn't re-join WCW, or didn't even go to WWF, where did he work? In April, he would debut for ECW's West Coast rival, Extreme Pro Wrestling, where he would make his first appearance at And Then There Were Four on April 15th, failing to win the XPW World title in a three-way dance against Shane Douglas and the champion Chris Candido, a match he was a late addition to. 2 weeks later on April 29th, with the title being vacated when Candido signed with WCW, Sabu would win a one-night tournament to become their new world champion. He would defeat Damian Steele, Cronus and the Messiah in one night to win the belt, and he would hold it for over a year before being stripped of the title for no-showing an event, while he would return to FMW and All Japan and wrestle on some indies. XPW seemed to be his main promotion in the US, at least until the early days of TNA, where he would also appear sporadically. All of this took place in an already difficult time for ECW, with several top wrestlers readying to leave, a bad relationship with TNN soon to end, and Paul's new crop of main eventers not quite ready to take the top spots yet. Paul had to be feeling the pressure, and no doubt didn't need another of his top talents appearing on Nitro. It seems that it took a while for the two to make amends, as Sabu claims in the James Romero interview that Heyman would block Sabu from being part of the Invasion storyline in 2001. Sabu says, "I was on bad terms with Paul, and Vince was talking to Paul and he wasn't talking to me." He goes on to say that he almost wasn't on the first One Night Stand event in 2005, where he would wrestle Rhino, perhaps replacing Rob Van Dam, who was injured. While Sabu didn't have the best of endings in ECW, to this day, 25 years later, he's one of the names that is most associated with those three letters. It's a testament to his legacy that the way he left isn't as remembered as the things he did there. As I've shown in this and in my last video about Sabu, he also had one of the most turbulent relationships with the company and with Paul Heyman, but there's no denying his legacy. While some wrestlers went straight on to become WWE superstars, others travelled all over the wrestling world, and ECW is still the promotion you think of first. Sabu is one of those, maybe even the best of those. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe. And before I end the video, I just really quickly wanted to say a massive thank you for the channel passing 2,000 subscribers earlier this week. Thank you very much, I really appreciate it.